Welcome, everybody, joining me today on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, glad to be bringing you guys more stories and topics around the NFL to start this week. Today, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about what Deion Sanders said in regards to his son, Shedeur Sanders, and his other star player, Travis Hunter, around the NFL draft next year in 2025. We're going to be talking trades with L'Jarius Sneed going to the Tennessee Titans and Hassan Reddick potentially being traded from the Philadelphia Eagles sooner rather than later. And stick around towards the end of the show where I'm going to be giving you guys my reaction to JJ McCarthy's Pro Day and impressing everybody with his workouts over there at Ann Arbor in Michigan. All of that is coming on today's episode. And before I jump into the first segment, I want to remind you guys, if you have any questions or comments that you want to make throughout today's episode, to please use the tip and donations link at gsmcpodcast.net with any of those questions. It only ensures that I can see your questions pop up here to the right of me in the chat box. I'm able to engage with you guys, maybe have some conversation, and answer some of the questions that you have during today's show. It's a big help for this show as well as all the other shows around the network, and it's always greatly appreciated anytime you guys are able to do that with any questions, comments, or anything you want to say. And in saying that, I'll jump into the first segment, the chip shot story of the day. Starting off with Deion Sanders, starting off with a little college football, some future NFL talents coming into the league around Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. Deion was most recently on the $1 Million Worth of Game podcast, and we've seen, or I've talked about on this show before, how Deion has already made some comments around only his son, Shedeur Sanders, and I took it lightheartedly when he, mentioned that next year how high he's going to be drafted and how he doesn't want his son going and playing in a cold weather city. And I didn't think that was too much to say as a dad, as a player that's had success in the NFL, and Deion being Deion, that's just something you come to expect from him if you follow the NFL and follow college football and know what kind of person Deion Sanders is. But now he's, kind of upped it a little more, including Travis Hunter as well, when they asked him, to be fair, the two hosts on the $1 Million Worth of Game podcast, they asked him where he sees Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter going in next year's draft. And Deion Sanders had some questionable or controversial quotes, if you want to say, for his response. He said, "All this is subjective because I know where I kind of want them to go. And let's not forget Shiloh, his other son." And he said, "But I know where I want them to go. There's certain cities where it ain't going to happen. It's going to be an Eli." In reference to Eli Manning back in 2004 when he told the Los Angeles Chargers not to draft him because he felt it wasn't the best situation for him, and he threatened to sit out the whole year if they drafted him anyway. The Chargers drafted him anyway, but they ended up trading him just later that night to the New York Giants, and the rest is history. But with these comments now with Deion, I think it opens up a lot of things to be taken seriously and lighthearted again. Lightheartedly, this is just Deion being Deion again. He's never been shy about saying anything, how he feels, especially in regards to family, his son. He's always going to say how he feels about them. But I think he took it a step further now, and I'm not for or against it. But in this sense, with Deion saying this stuff about both of them, he said before this that they were going to go top 4. He said one of them's going to go first overall and the other one's not going to make it past 4. So he already has those expectations set of him. And on top of saying that he already knows what kind of cities he doesn't want them to play in, how that could raise some question marks for some teams, if they want to always have Deion in their ear somewhat or commenting. It doesn't have to be directly to them. But do they always just want to see it, be asked about it from media? Because, media are always going to be asking teams, coaches, GMs about what Deion said if one of these players is drafted there and what they think of what he said. So that, it comes with drafting one of these players. And you have to think, if you're an NFL team, an organization, do you want that on your team? Do you want to take that burden, I guess, for lack of a better words, on with a star player like Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter? Because just watching them this past season in Colorado, I don't think anybody can doubt their talent, how good they are, how good they can be in the NFL. But what these comments do, not only does it, bring a spotlight to them, I think now going into next season with Colorado, you expect them to be better because they tailed off towards the end of last season and they were pretty bad, specifically on offense or on defense. So you expect them to be better. They can't really be worse in that aspect. So people don't really talk about Shedeur and Travis and playing better. They had great seasons individually, but you want to see them now translate that to the team success as well as still performing their expected outcomes in terms of, touchdowns, yards, and stuff like that. For Travis, how good he does on defense as well because he plays both sides of the ball. What these comments, I think, does is not only just, like I mentioned, bring that spotlight onto them, but it raises the expectations a little bit for them to perform now because Deion can say this. He said this a lot about himself, calling his own shots, because he was such a great player and cashing those checks because he knew that he could write these checks that he could cash because he knew how good he was. I'm not saying he's writing these checks for them because he's not saying anything too outlandish, but it's just sort of upping that pressure, that attention people are now going to have on them because Deion is saying such things about them, limiting them to some teams, and now organizations will be thinking, am I one of those teams? Do I have to worry about that and going through another extra step? And what this ultimately leads me into is this idea I touched on a few weeks ago when I talked about Deion and Caleb Williams not deciding to go to the combine, Malik Neighbors not working out at the combine, and more players taking it upon themselves to make these sort of decisions for them in their best interest. They talked about it on ESPN today, and I think more people are starting to realize this in media and just around the NFL and college football, that because of NIL and because of so much power being brought to these players now, these high-end players, really these generational types of players, more so than not, you're going to see more of these instances where players don't have agents, they want to represent themselves, they decide not to go to their pro days like Marvin Harrison, not decide to work out at the combine, only give certain teams their medicals, and really just leverage it more because more and more with NIL, with these mega deals coming to these young kids so early on, or I should say these young adults, it comes with a responsibility, and it's a good thing because it gives them more responsibility, more able to handle that responsibility early on. But because of that now, they start thinking more on the business side. They start thinking what's best for them. And quite honestly, it translates to other sports as well. If you look at the college basketball for women as well, it was a few seasons ago or last season where Angel Reese said, she's in no rush to be heading into the WNBA because of NIL and because of how financially stable she's already been in college. There's no reason to adhere to some of the things from WNBA teams, from professional teams that think that they have all that these young players would want and want to come to the league right away. It's starting that attention and that want to be in the league because you make big money, you get big contracts, you become financially secure. I think it's starting to lessen now with the introduction of NIL. But I want to stress that this isn't really for everyone. This is only this is only applies to these big players like an Angel Reese, like a Caleb Williams, like a Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter, these sort of big generational type players that garner all this attention, garner all this branding and teams coming to them for their name, image, and likeness. This only applies to them, but this is really only the tipping point is what I really want to get at to this whole situation of player empowerment. I'm all for it. I think this is great. but it is a thin line. And I think I was watching ESPN this morning, and Andrew Hawkins actually said it best, I thought, when I was watching. He said that there is a thin line between player empowerment, which is good. I think a lot of people would be for that. But on the other side, it's player entitlement and how negatively that could paint some of these players when they get to the league, in the locker room, their character. It could come off wrong or a bit arrogant sometimes. So there is a thin line to walk there. But positively, if it all works out for these players and they manage it right, I think we're going to start to see more of these instances where these players aren't really in a rush to just be drafted by any organization. They'll really come out with more of these comments like, oh, I want to go here, or I want to go here. I don't really want to go there to the Chicago Bears, or I don't really want to go to the Commanders because of so-and-so. You're going to start to see more people be more outspoken in that way. I think it's great, ultimately, because the bottom line is, there's only so much time these players have in the league, and being able to play this highly competitive, highly dangerous sport in football, in some cases, so they want, and people should know that they want to get the best out of their career and want to be in the best situation that they think that'll get the best out of them and have a lengthy, prosperous career. And that's really the bottom line in all of this. It makes sense because this is their career, this is their life. They should get a say in what they want to do, especially if money's not really the deciding factor. If that's not really teetering this conversation, then why shouldn't they decide where they want to go? A lot of people now might not like it if it gets ramped up quickly, but like I mentioned before, I don't think it's going to move up that fast in terms of all players now saying this, because it does come with a caveat that you do have to be not only performing, which is the biggest and main thing, performing on the field. That way you gain more attention, more of these brand opportunities and stuff like that. But you have to be able to manage it in the right way where people aren't put off by it, and you don't seem like a jerk, quite honestly, and you don't seem full of yourself. You still remain humble, honed in on keeping the main thing, like a lot of people say in sports. If you teeter that line well, I think this could only go well for players and their careers and getting the most out of it. Sort of like the NBA, that it's now become more, or really almost all about player empowerment and players looking out for the best interests in themselves. You look at James Harden moving around a lot, Kawhi, Kevin Durant moving around. The NFL hasn't really been there, but more and more with the introduction of NIL, I think it'll become not to the level of the NBA, but very close, because these players, young people, are starting to get more power and responsibility earlier on than they ever have before. And it could be off-putting for a lot of people that aren't used to this, don't really embrace that change. But I think ultimately it's the best thing for these players coming into the league young, managing their own life, what benefits them the most. I think could only end up well. And we're going to see how it all develops going forward. Deion is kind of the catalyst, the start of all of this, and I think more and more you're going to see players and coaches even do more of what Deion, Caleb, and Shedeur Sanders are doing now to start this whole movement now into the NFL. And in saying that, I'll leave it there on that conversation. It's very interesting to see how it'll develop, but it allows me now to move on into the first break of the show. And on the other side, I'm going to be bringing you more trade talks around Hassan Reddick and L'Jarius Sneed, plus later on in the show as well, my reactions to J.J. McCarthy's Pro Day last Friday and how he impressed a bunch of scouts and how it affects his draft stocks. So don't go anywhere. All those stories are coming up right after this on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Back here now on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to talk more about trades. And one trade that already happened is L'Jarius Sneed being traded over the weekend to the Tennessee Titans. The details on the trade were that the Kansas City Chiefs sent L'Jarius Sneed to the Titans for a 2025 third-round pick and a 2024 seventh-round pick swap this year. So initially, when you see that, you might think it's really not a lot for L'Jarius Sneed, who had an amazing regular season and an even better postseason with some of the plays that he made. The biggest one, most notable one, just for me, is the play he made on Zay Flowers in the AFC Championship game, where he punched the ball out just before Zay Flowers reached the goal line, changing that whole dynamic of the momentum, the drive, and resulting in a touchback, saving the Chiefs from conceding those points. It made a big difference in the game, obviously, with how the second half turned out in that game, sending the Chiefs to a Super Bowl and ultimately winning them their back-to-back Super Bowls that they had. And the biggest question with Sneed and the Chiefs really this offseason was to really decide between two of their best players, more impactful players in Chris Jones and L'Jarius Sneed. Both of them deserved and were asking for a big contract based off of the results and all that they have done for the Kansas City Chiefs. Whether you think Chris Jones or L'Jarius Sneed was more important, that's up to you. I think most people would say Chris Jones, in all honesty, as would I, because of what he meant, because of the play he made in the Super Bowl there to save a touchdown that the 49ers, I thought, had a walk-in with George Kittle, but because Chris Jones was in Brock Purdy's face, that pass was incomplete and they had to settle for a field goal. Those kind of plays, I think, really were what made the difference for the Kansas City Chiefs in deciding to keep Chris Jones. They signed him to a massive deal towards the start of free agency, and they franchise tagged L'Jarius Sneed, which in theory would keep him here for another year, but mutually behind the scenes they agreed to look for a trade for L'Jarius Sneed if they couldn't come to terms on a long-term deal that satisfied his needs for money and financial reasons. And that's where we end up now at this trade that sends him over to Tennessee. And it was reported that the Tennessee Titans would agree to a new contract with Sneed that would be a 4-year, $76 million contract with them, $19 million per year, and $55 million of the 76 being fully guaranteed. Now L'Jarius Sneed becomes the third highest paid defensive back in the NFL, just behind Jair Alexander and Denzel Ward, who make $20 or $21 million per year. So he jumps right up to the top of that leaderboard. He's only 27 years old, so a 4-year deal isn't really a bad investment, in my opinion. He's really in the prime of his career now, and based on how well he played, I think it made all the sense for the Tennessee Titans to trade for a player like him. I'm liking what the Tennessee Titans are doing, adding L'Jarius Sneed to that defensive back room that wasn't the best last season, and now they brought in Chidobe Awuzie from the Cincinnati Bengals. They kept Roger McCreary, who was a high draft pick a few years ago. They got rid of Kristen Fulton, who signed with the Los Angeles Chargers. But those three, L'Jarius Sneed, Awuzie, and McCreary, I think is a solid core to build around. Obviously, you want to have more depth, quality depth around those three, but having those three as your main guys, I think is a big improvement than what they had last year, on top of other superstars that they have like Jeffrey Simmons bringing over Kenneth Murray to replace Azeez Al-Shaair, who signed with the Houston Texans, is also big. So they kind of got a little something going there for the Titans. I like their additions on defense now with Snead rounding it all out. On offense, it doesn't go without saying that they signed Calvin Ridley, obviously, to that massive deal. And adding him to DeAndre Hopkins, they signed Tony Pollard. They signed a new center in Lloyd Cushenberry as well. So they made sure to revamp that offense, kind of modernize it a little bit. I talked about it a few weeks ago as well. The new identity that Brian Callahan wants to bring over to the Tennessee Titans as their new head coach, I think it's good for them, which is funny because if this was still Mike Vrabel and he brought in Calvin Ridley and not so much L'Jarius Sneed, but the way he played, smash mouth, in your face, running it at least 25 times a game, I wouldn't think those pieces fit. But because Brian Callahan is coming from a pass, vertical spread offense like the Cincinnati Bengals with Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon, T. Higgins, all these weapons, I think he's bringing that idea over to the Tennessee Titans, and I think it's good for them because I like how Will Levis finished off the year last season. I think he's shown great potential. Now they add to that and that sort of ceiling that he's built out or that he's projected to have. I like the way that they're moving, and if I were to deem a winner of this trade, for right now, I'm saying, because of how the teams sit right now, I would go with the Titans because they got better in this trade. The Chiefs undisputedly got worse. They lost their best corner. You can't say that they got better or stayed the same. The Titans got better. They didn't give up too much to get L'Jarius Sneed. And the only question around this move for the Titans, in all honesty, would be the amount of money they paid him because they paid so much already for Calvin Ridley. And Calvin Ridley is 30 years old already, so you could question that decision-making there. But just on this trade, looking at what each team gave up and what they got, I think the winner is the Titans quite clearly because they got better, in all honesty. And for the Chiefs, they could become the eventual winner. That's the caveat. Because they freed up $20 million of cap space, that's a lot of cap space by getting rid of L'Jarius Sneed. If they were to add someone pretty big, like a Tyler Boyd or an Xavier Howard to replace L'Jarius Sneed, then I might change my vote a little bit and say that the Chiefs, playing the long game, they were the winner. But in the short-term winner is the Tennessee Titans right now. And like I mentioned, they owe a lot of money to Ridley and Sneed, so I think that only adds a bit more pressure for them to perform under Brian Callahan and with Will Levis. I have confidence in that they will do that. I like the way that Cincinnati ran their offense. They had a lot of success with Callahan and Joe Burrow and all the weapons. So the fundamental idea is there. I like what they're building. They just have to add a bit more to it right now to rough up those edges and really make this thing look sharp. Because you lost such a big playmaker like Derrick Henry, and he was really the whole offense or your whole identity on offense, it's going to take some time to switch over now to this idea that Brian Callahan has, especially with a young quarterback now trying to learn a whole new playbook, a whole new system with a new head coach and stuff like that. It's going to take some time, but I always will side to modernizing, not being so rigid with change and sticking to traditions. As a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, I know that's all that they're based on and what they really can't switch off of. So the way that the Titans are doing it, and to the Steelers' credit a little bit now this offseason, I've mentioned how aggressive that they've been. It's refreshing to see. I think Tennessee Titans fans will share that same sentiment and embrace this change that's coming with them. L'Jarius Sneed is a huge addition to their team. I'm sure he's going to make this thing really click on defense, where they still need to add a few more pieces, in my opinion. The secondary looks better now with all those players that I mentioned, but last week I talked about some of the big free agents left on the market, and one of them was Jeffrey Simmons, and where he could end up in all of this. I mentioned the Colts as one of the teams. I think I picked the Colts to be the most ideal situation for him because I didn't think Julian Blackmon was coming back. it made sense to bring in a safety more experienced to just fill in right away there for the Colts. But now I'm looking at this Tennessee team, and it's looking a bit more intriguing than the Colts. It's within the same division, but the Colts really haven't made as big of moves to improve their team. They brought back Michael Pittman, which was huge, gave him a new deal. But other than that, just comparing the two teams, I think if I were Justin Simmons and I am 31 years old or 30 years old, I'm looking for success right now. Coming out of the situation with the Denver Broncos, you don't really want that. I'm not saying the Colts are that, but they're a lot closer to that than the Titans are right now, in my opinion. It would make sense for Justin Simmons now to really consider the Titans to be a team that takes him up at least for a year. I think a year or two would be a good deal for the Tennessee Titans to sign Justin Simmons because he'll be a bit more expensive just because of his contract and the sort of player that he is, a more established player in the league. So I think that's one option that they could go with. They also need pass rushers, and they hold the number 7 pick in the draft this year. A lot of mocks have them drafting an offensive tackle, which would make sense to add to that offense. If you're not going to have Derrick Henry gaining you those extra yards, you need to make sure that offensive line is really good for Tony Pollard. To see the success you had with Tony Pollard 2 seasons ago that he had with the Dallas Cowboys, not so much this past season. So that would be another option. But if this all works out and they add the right pieces, they could trade back, which I wouldn't hate also. That's the growing theme on this show. I'm a big fan of trading back. I've just now come to realize I've suggested that to all these teams. But, that would be an option. At 7, Joe Alt is an option. DJ Turner is an option if they want to do that. For right now, I like what the Tennessee Titans are doing. And for the Kansas City Chiefs, I mentioned, they got worse. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because they got worse on defense. Overall, as a team, yeah, you can say that. But by worse, I just really meant on defense. And what's funny about the Chiefs is that they won the Super Bowl with a team that a lot of people would say was the worst that Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid have had in that whole era with Patrick Mahomes. And now, I think this Chiefs team, the best that it can be is that when they have a solid defense, they don't have to be shut down and all world like they were last year. But if they're decent, able to get a stop here or there and allow less than 20 points, 21 points per game, and this offense gets better, that's the biggest thing, with Marquise Brown coming in, and I expect them to add another receiver in the draft. If this offense gets better, quite frankly, they could only get better. I think that's the best version of the Chiefs that we could see. In just all my time watching them, they've seemed the most unstoppable, most dangerous when their offense has all these weapons. Patrick Mahomes is just throwing it all over the field effortlessly, not getting touched. They have a good offensive line now. They've improved that wide receiver. I know they got worse on defense, but that's really where I see them be their best version. A decent defense and an offense that just has all these weapons. They already have Pacheco. Rashee Rice look great. Travis Kelce, you know what you're going to get out of him. I think Marquise Brown will be good for them to stretch the field out. And if they could add another receiver, whether it be Tyler Boyd, like I mentioned, or Xavier, I'm going to get his name wrong. Is it Weaver? Xavier Weaver from Texas? I can't believe I'm drawing a blank. But the receiver from Texas, if they can get him, that would be great for this offense. It'll bring them back to what they sort of had with Tyreek Hill. It might take a while to develop it, but it would really increase their chances, I think, to be that unstoppable, just unplayable team that we saw a few years ago when they first won their Super Bowl. And in that aspect, really you could say neither of these teams really lost too much. If you had to give an answer, I would say the Chiefs. But for right now, I think this was the best thing for both teams. Similar to Justin Fields and the Chicago Bears, it just came to a point where it had to happen, and you just had to take the offer that was there. Getting 2 picks like that isn't the worst for the Chiefs. They could use it. Knowing them, they'll turn that 3rd rounder or 7th round pick into a superstar in that offense under Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. I think it worked out best for both of these teams. I'm excited to see how the Chiefs look, and even more so what the Tennessee Titans look for and look like this upcoming season. But enough on those two teams. I will shift now into the second break of this show, and on the other side of it, I'm still going to stick on the topic of trades, this time talking about the Philadelphia Eagles and their situation with Haason Reddick, how a trade could be coming down the pipeline in a few weeks, or in a few days now actually, as well as my reactions to J.J. McCarthy's pro day and how he impressed all the scouts and coaches that attended his pro day. So much more coming up on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Don't go anywhere.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. On the second half of the show, we're going to get into the trade talks, trade rumors around Haason Reddick and the Philadelphia Eagles. But before that, I want to remind you guys one last time in this show, if you have any questions or comments that you want to make, use the tip and donations link running across the ticker below me at gsmcpodcast.net. It makes sure I'm able to see your question. It pops up right away here on my list to my right, and I'm able to engage with you guys, answer any of the questions that you may have. We always appreciate it here at the GSMC Podcast Network. It's a big help for me and all the show and all the shows across the network as well. But going back into that topic of Haason Reddick and his trade potentially coming sooner rather than later for him and the Philadelphia Eagles, it's been an ongoing topic with Reddick and the Eagles that it started before when they gave him permission for a trade, and it was looking like a decision that the Eagles had to make between him and Josh Sweat because of the contracts that they were both on, and recent reports from Josina Anderson that, you know, both teams have expressed, or multiple teams have expressed interest in Haason Reddick, and further reports that say Reddick might be looking for a bigger deal because of how productive he has been with the Philadelphia Eagles. He could be looking for more money, a bigger contract, because currently he is the 14th best paid edge rusher in the NFL and making $15 million per year compared to guys like, you know, Myles Garrett, TJ Watt that are up in the 25s, close to $30 million per year. In my opinion, I don't think you can name me 14 better pass rushers than Haason Reddick, so I do support him if the reports are true, looking for a better deal. But it all has to work out with the Eagles because he does have 1 year left on his contract with the Eagles after signing that 3-year deal back in 2022. He still is on a contract technically with them, so they don't have to get rid of him. It's just an interest that they are looking for someone to suit him in the financial side of things because of that big contract that they probably couldn't afford after paying Saquon and having other extensions coming down the line, paying Landon Dickerson lately as well. It all wouldn't fit in their books. So they could write it out 1 more year and then lose him in free agency, but obviously they wouldn't want to do that and want to get something back for Reddick. And one of the biggest things to remember with Reddick is that the Eagles pushed a $1 million roster bonus that was due to Haason Reddick on April 1st. They pushed it back. It was originally due March 15th, but they pushed it back to April 1st. So that sort of could give you a timeline of where you could see a trade going on, because obviously if your intentions aren't to keep him long term, you wouldn't pay him that extra $1 million. So come April 1st, if a decision's not made on him moving, or there's no real traction on this news story, I think, one, the Eagles would be in trouble if he's still on their books and they decide to pay him, because I don't think it would work out for them long term to pay Hassan Reddick that much more money. But on the other hand, they've already said, you had Howie Roseman and Nick Sirianni, I think, as well, comment on the topic of Nolan Smith and wanting to use him more. He wasn't really a factor for how high they drafted him out of Georgia. He wasn't really used as much or at all this past season, and it could be looked at as a waste in some aspects. So they want to use him. They want to incorporate him more. So that kind of alleviates the pressure or the pushback you get from trading a guy like Hassan Reddick. But they also traded, or they signed Bryce Huff, formerly of the New York Jets. After coming off of his best season, they signed him as well. So they kind of have some replacements there for Reddick. And just last season, Reddick hasn't had the best season. You know, he was coming off of back-to-back double-digit seasons. But last year, he wasn't really that much of a factor compared to when he had, I think it was 16 and a half sacks, and was only behind, or was tied for second in the league with Myles Garrett at 16 and a half. So he wasn't really putting up those numbers, obviously, but, you know, I still think he has that potential. And for anybody that's trying to trade for him, I think there's still a lot of good suitors out there. But right now, like most of these deals that we've seen, I think it just depends on the compensation the Eagles get, what kind of, you know, compensation that they could get back for Reddick, because he is a good player, and it would be foolish to keep him and then lose him for nothing next year. And if a trade were to happen, some of the teams that make the most sense and have been rumored have been the Arizona Cardinals. The biggest thing for them is having Jonathan Gannon. He was the Eagles' former defensive coordinator, and he's now there as their head coach in Arizona. He had the most success with Hassan Reddick when he was there, like I mentioned, in his first season, 16 and a half sacks. Arizona clearly needs a pass rusher and playmakers on that defensive side of the ball, quite honestly. They just need any playmaker on there. I think that would really be interesting for Hassan Reddick to consider because of the relationship he already has with Gannon. I think he would be that centerpiece for that defense quite easily. And as well, I think they finished off last season in a good place. You know, Kyler Murray looked good to some extent. James Conner was looking good. And they rattled off some pretty big wins, including one against the Philadelphia Eagles, if I'm not mistaken, and the Dallas Cowboys as well at one point in the season last year. So it went as good as it could have for Jonathan Gannon and the Cardinals with the sort of roster that he inherited and the sort of talent. I think he made the most out of it. And he found some good pieces as well to build around. Trading for a Hassan Reddick, I think, would only make them better, more competitive for sure. They're not going to jump levels and years ahead of this whole project, but I think it'll certainly help for them to get a pass rusher because of how important they are in the league. And another team that could be of interest and I think makes a lot of sense is the Atlanta Falcons. Their biggest and more impactful pass rushers last season were Bud Dupree and Calais Campbell. They are currently unrestricted free agents, and they're really the only ones that created any sort of pressure or really posed any sort of threat for opposing offensive lines and teams. They're not on the team right now. It doesn't look like they're really a priority to come back, so that's one thing. And on the other hand, the Falcons are on their third defensive coordinator in 3 years to try and resolve this pass rushing problem that they've had over the last few years. It's been evident, you know, Grady Jarrett is really the only other one that creates any sort of pressure. They have had some impressive rookies come in, but again, the production in terms of quarterback pressure, being in someone's face, it hasn't really been there. They've addressed other areas with Jesse Bates and A.J. Terrell being good pieces, in my opinion. in the back end in the secondary, but they can only do so much when the quarterback has 4 seconds to throw the ball. They can only hold their coverage for so long before someone is going to get open. So they hold the 8th pick in the draft. They could go that way if they don't really see the Eagles really fit their price range for them to trade for Hassan Reddick. But those two are the biggest ones for me. And I guess just the questions you have now, if a trade were to happen or if a trade wasn't to happen, would be, is Bryce Huff ready to step into that role for the Philadelphia Eagles after they lost Fletcher Cox? Brandon Graham is still there, but he's not really giving you much like he used to before. Is he ready to step into that role if you were to get rid of Hassan Reddick right away? Same with Nolan Smith. Could he give you something promising to contribute right away? You know what you have in Jalen Carter already, so he's not really too much of a worry. Josh Sweat as well. He restructured his contract, so he's looking likely to stay. But it's that other pass rusher that you really have questions on. Can you trust Hassan Reddick, like I mentioned before, to find that spark again? That's something you have to consider. And, all this, it really just depends on what the Eagles are looking for. I think the biggest theme in this offseason is the expectations and all the price ranges that we think are fair have all really fallen short of what actually ended up happening. I just finished talking about L'Jarius Sneed going for a 3rd and a 7th. Justin Fields went for a 6th. That could turn into a 4th. Other quarterbacks have gone for less. So I don't think the Eagles would be wise to hold on for a 2nd or a 3rd round pick. If they could get a 3rd round pick, I think I would do the trade just because of financial reasons and salary cap reasons. If you don't want to pay him long term, I would take a 3rd. Paired up with a 6th or a 7th potentially. I think that's as good as you can get for Hassan Reddick at this point. With these other teams that are picking high anyway, the Cardinals have 2 picks in the first round, and the Falcons have the 8th pick in the first round. So if you're not going to trade with them, there hasn't really been other teams reported. You're kind of running out of options as well. So that's kind of where this whole situation stands. Overall, I think Hassan Reddick can still be that player, but I don't think he could be that player for the Eagles to want them to pay him as much money as he is reported to want in a new deal. But I think he can contribute to these other teams that are on the come up and need a pass rusher right away to at least give them something, be an improvement to what they had last season. That's where Hassan Reddick and the Eagles stand right now. That's all in development. It'll all become clearer more and more as now we're heading into April, getting closer to the draft. All these moves are going to start become a lot more clearer in the NFL throughout this offseason. But in saying that, I will move on to the final break of this show. And on the other side of it, I will be going into J.J. McCarthy's pro day and what impression he left on scouts, impressions he left on me, and some of the comments that were made on him, some of the throws that were posted all over social media. I'm going to talk about all of that stuff right here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. That story coming up next.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast for the final time in today's show. We're going to go over J.J. McCarthy's pro day and one of the biggest risers in this year's NFL draft, one of the biggest stories, potentially the biggest story depending on how you view all of these moves panning out with the Vikings, with the Chargers, the Arizona Cardinals being a spot to trade into. J.J. McCarthy could arguably be the biggest catalyst of how all this draft pans out. a lot of attention is put on the big three, the top three picks in the draft, Caleb, Jalen, potentially Drake May. That has really seen or driven this whole narrative around the draft. But if you really look at it, JJ could really be that spark that changes and flips this draft on its head, forces a team to trade up really high, give up a lot of stuff, and really go all in on JJ McCarthy. And that's just all based on the sort of season that he had and the combine workout that he had. Already impressed people, like I mentioned at the combine. The season goes without saying. He had a great end of his spell there in Michigan, winning the national championship, was on the best team by far in all of college football. So already he's coming from a winning program. He knows what it goes into winning and what that whole sort of process is like. People just really had questions about his production, his numbers, the sort of athletic traits you see with some of these other guys like Jaden Daniels running all over the field, his running ability, as well as passing. Same with Caleb, his running ability, his ability to extend plays and throw the ball a million miles down the field accurately. That draws people in a lot. So JJ was really the only one that kind of took a step back, but was the only one really under question with some of the numbers that he put up. Just last season, he had 2,900 yards, 199 average per yards per game, and had 713 attempts in his 3 seasons there at Michigan, which was the lowest among the top 4 prospects in this year's draft. So, those numbers are lower than a lot of people, but the caveat there is, the winning. He was part of winning, being successful in college football, winning the championship and all of that. So that was the biggest thing. And with his pro day now last Friday, a lot of people went there to see some of his throws, some of his timing, ball placement, and all that sort of stuff. And I think a lot of things, just from what I saw on social media, I'm sure everyone's seen it by now, the throws that he makes, the one where he rolls out left, turns around like 360 and just chucks it down to the back left side of the end zone to Blake Corum. That one drew all the attention. A lot of throws were great and just on the money, just from what I saw. He threw a lot of the deep ball as well to show all the naysayers that, the deep ball wasn't there. His arm strength wasn't to the level of a Caleb Williams. All of that he put on display on Friday, and ESPN's Matt Miller was one of the people that commented, kind of summed up his pro day when he said, McCarthy's throwing session lasted nearly 25 minutes and was clean with just 2 clear misses while showcasing sip, touch, while hitting a lot of deep routes with easy power and velocity. Like I mentioned, you could see all of those throws on social media. They were posted all over the place, hyping J.J. McCarthy up even more. And I think his rise and seeing this sort of develop now with general manager scouts, I think them realizing now that he is, in my opinion, I think he's top 3. I would take him over Drake May, in all honesty, just because I think you can compare the talent with Drake May, but the winning is the biggest thing for me. Coming from a established, great program in Michigan, success with Jim Harbaugh, that NFL-like environment that Harbaugh provides, clearly now that he's also in the NFL, I think you can't really measure that, and his sort of character, attitude, and mental side of it. I think, Drake May can't do anything about it because he was in North Carolina. If he were to change it, obviously he would be in a better situation if he were to determine that. But because of that, not being able to determine where you go or how it all pans out with your team, I think JJ was fortunate to be in such a great situation with Michigan, and that panned out the best for him, obviously with the success that they had. I think really that's the deciding factor for me. He's coming from a established and very stable organization with Michigan and Jim Harbaugh, which just really tips the scale for me in deciding between him and May. When it comes to Jaden Daniels and Caleb, I just think they have that talent-wise thing that you really just can't teach or can't develop in some quarterbacks. I think the gap is still close. I'm not saying Caleb and Jaden are up here and JJ's way down here. I think it's more sort of like here-ish, just because JJ, I think, has impressed people and has shown people his arm strength and arm talent is better than what they anticipated. But with Caleb and Jaden, I just think they provide a bit more of that special trait. I could be completely wrong, and some teams like the Commanders or the Bears draft JJ ahead of Caleb and Jaden. You don't really know, but that's how I would evaluate them. And he answered some of the biggest questions, like I mentioned. And when they asked him about it afterwards, what sort of things he wanted to disprove out here or prove to these NFL teams was, he said, I just wanted to showcase the questions they had about outbreakers to the left and putting some air on the deep routes, stuff like that. I felt like I did that today. I'm pretty confident with the showing I put out there, and so on and so forth. He went on to talk about that even more. And like I mentioned, I liked what I saw out of his pro day. When I was talking about the combine just, again, a few weeks ago, I mentioned how JJ, by throwing at the combine, I think really helped him to start those tricklings, those whispers between scouts, like, oh, like this kid's like pretty good. This kid's actually better than we thought. Jaden and Caleb had the pleasure of being talented and not really having to do that with questions around Drake May, I think, and JJ. By Drake May not throwing at the combine, and JJ throwing at it, I think he kind of elevated above Drake May in that aspect, for me at least. And now, having this pro day, showing out even more with some crazy throws that impressed scouts and wowed everybody on social media with that, brought more eyes to JJ, I think only increased his chances of going up more on boards. And the other side of it, the personality, the character-wise thing, like I mentioned, I think that was his biggest trait. I think that's the biggest thing that people are left really impressed the most with. Yeah, the arm talent and the on-the-field display surprised them, pleasantly surprised them, but with his character, I think that's the thing that they were most assured of, the thing that they really don't have to worry about with him. So he already gained a gold star in that category. Now they are pleasantly surprised in all these other aspects. It has risen him up to top 3, top 4 level of a talent. And it all really just depends on fit and how these teams evaluate them. Obviously, the biggest thing about this whole draft is the Vikings and how they could shake this whole thing up if they trade up and try to get JJ. Because I think he's still seen as the one still looking out. Not in my opinion, but that's just how I think the media paints it right now. Trading to that 4 spot, I think people would still believe that JJ will be in it around there. But if I were the Vikings and I saw this pro day, how impressive it was and how good of a feeling he left for all these teams, I would really be going after the Patriots and trying to trade for that 3rd pick, because you don't know what the Patriots would really do. Again, no surprise, I would trade back if I was the Patriots, but if they were to go with a quarterback, they could very well take JJ, and maybe the Vikings don't want Drake May. A lot of teams feel like the Vikings are in on JJ McCarthy and wanting him to be their franchise guy. He's already had meetings with the Giants and the Commanders prior to his pro day. Now this week he has a private workout with the Minnesota Vikings, so that already is showing me some interest, legitimate interest from the Vikings. So that's one thing. Today at the NFL honors meeting, Jim Harbaugh reiterated his sentiment, saying that he is the best quarterback in this draft and the best quarterback that he's seen, at least at the college level. You know, he said it's something about his mental and how he gets on the field. He just turns into a killer, is how he put it. So that, on top of everything else, I think JJ's really done no harm at all in this offseason. It's worked out the best for him. And the biggest topic to me is if McCarthy if McCarthy makes it to 3 and 4, like I mentioned before with the Patriots, you know, what is he going to take for maybe the Giants or the Vikings, like I mentioned, to move up right away. I think this is probably a trade that we're going to have to wait and see on the draft day and how it all pans out. But that sort of factor of having the confidence to wait, not jump the gun, and overpay right now for a draft pick, having the confidence to sit and wait to see how it all plays out is risky because your guy could be gone. But if he gets to number 3, I think it could really get exciting in this draft because if JJ's still there at 3 with Drake May, you're going to see a lot of people, or it will be reported after with the Patriots, that a lot of teams, a lot of people are calling them to trade whatever is necessary for that pick. And if I'm the Patriots, I say that I'm open to trading that 3rd pick, but I'm not really considering anything until draft day. If they decide that's the way they want to go and accumulate draft capital, I'm not saying anything until draft day. Then I'm picking up the phone and seeing what teams are willing to give up to get the best out of my situation. Because like I mentioned before, the Patriots need more than one thing, one quarterback to change this thing around. Waiting to see how desperate teams get, I think, is the best scenario. The most entertaining scenario, definitely, for all of us watching at home. It always leads to the most surprises. And just to wrap this whole thing up, I think one of the biggest pro days undoubtedly this offseason was this Michigan one, and seeing how JJ participated, because Michigan, coming off of a national championship, had a lot of great players, a lot of talent that people went to see. I think it says a lot about how good JJ really is. If he was the one that made all the headlines, if he was the one that drew the most eyes, was the one most talked about at the end of the day, because they had players like Roman Wilson, Chris Jenkins on the defensive line, a bunch of offensive and defensive linemen that are very great. I think it says a lot. If you didn't get a chance to watch the pro day or see some of the throws, just seeing that JJ was the one that was the real superstar out of all of these talented players, I think it tells you all you need to know if you need a quarterback in this draft. There's no category or box that JJ really hasn't checked at all throughout this offseason. Like I mentioned before, he's been great in the interviews. Probably that's what's been the most talked about thing for these teams. They just needed to see the on-the-field product, and I think he blew them out of the water. And again, I'll say if I'm drafting, I am taking JJ. I'm making sure JJ is the 3rd one taking off of this board. If I'm the Vikings, the Giants, the Raiders, the Broncos are in there as well. If JJ makes it past 2, I'm taking him without a doubt. That's just me and how I feel about it. Again, I would love to know how you guys feel about it, what you guys think. If you leave it in the comments below, I would love to see what you guys think in the comment section as well. But in saying that, I'm excited to see how JJ develops and how this whole thing develops with the draft and trades and stuff like that. It's only going to get crazier, which is the good thing for us and for me, getting to talk about it more and more. But in saying that, that is where I'll leave that topic. And unfortunately, I have run out of time in today's episode. And now, as always, I want to remind you guys to please like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Make sure to also follow the network on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok for more of the network's content just outside of sports as well. There's a lot of good stuff out there around the network. If you want to see more of me and this show, check out the GSMC Sports Network channel and the GSMC Podcast Network channel on YouTube for more of the live shows that are all on there that I recorded before, as well as YouTube shorts that are posted every weekday as well, and individual segment videos if you missed a segment or want to go back and watch one of the segments that you really liked. It's all on there on both of the channels as well. Make sure to tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more football conversations and stories around the NFL with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thanking you guys again, as always, greatly for tuning into this episode. I will see you guys all tomorrow. Take care, guys.
Mm-hmm. 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 Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't